The ex-slaves who fought with the British while the Patriots battled for freedom from Great Britain, upwards of 20,000 runaway slaves declared their own personal independence and fought on the side of the British, when American colonists took up arms in a battle for independence starting in 1775. That fight for freedom excluded an entire race of people, African Americans. On November 12, 1775, General George Washington decreed in his orders that any either Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men could enlist in the Continental Army. 2 days after the Patriots' military leader banned African Americans from joining his ranks, however, black soldiers proved their mettle at the Battle of Kemp's Landing along the Virginia coast. They captured an enemy commanding officer and proved pivotal in securing the victory for the British. After the battle, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia who had been forced to flee the capital of Williamsburg and form a government in exile aboard the warship HMS Fowey, ordered the British standard raised before making a startling announcement. For the first time in public he formally read a proclamation that he had issued the previous week granting freedom to the slaves of rebels who escaped to British custody. A copy of Dunmore's proclamation, issued November 7, 1775, credit, public domain. Dunmore's proclamation was more an announcement of military strategy than a pronouncement of abolitionist principles, according to author Gary Ben-Ash in The Unknown American Revolution. The Unearly Birth of Democracy and the Struggle to Create America. The document not only provided the British with an immediate source of manpower, it weakened Virginia's patriots by depriving them of their main source of labor. Much like Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, however, Dunmore's proclamation was limited in scope. Careful not to alienate Britain's white loyalist allies, the measure applied only to slaves whose masters were in rebellion against the crown. The British regularly returned slaves who fled from loyalist masters. Dunmore's proclamation inspired thousands of slaves to risk their lives in search of freedom. They swam, dog-paddled and rowed to Dunmore's floating government in exile on Chesapeake Bay in order to find protection with the British forces. By mid-1776, what had been a small stream of escaping slaves now turned into a torrent, wrote Nash. Over the next 7 years, enslaved Africans mounted the greatest slave rebellion in American history. Among those slaves making a break for freedom were 8 belonging to Peyton Randolph, Speaker of the Virginia House of Burgesses, and several belonging to Patriot orator Patrick Henry, who apparently took his famous words "Oh, give me liberty, or give me death!" to heart and fled to British custody. Another runaway who found sanctuary with Dunmore was Harry Washington, who escaped from Mount Vernon while his famous master led the Continental Army. Dunmore placed these black loyalists in the newly formed Ethiopian regiment and had the words "O liberty to slaves" embroidered on their uniform sashes. Since the idea of escaped slaves armed with guns stirred terror even among white loyalists, Dunmore placated the slaveholders by primarily using the runaways as laborers building forts, bridges and trenches and engaging in trades such as shoemaking, blacksmithing and carpentry. Women worked as nurses, cooks and seamstresses. As manpower issues grew more dire as the war progressed, however, the British Army became more amenable to arming runaway slaves and sending them into battle. General Henry Clinton organized an all-black regiment, the Black Pioneers. Among the hundreds of runaway slaves in its ranks was Harry Washington, who rose to the rank of corporal and participated in the siege of Charleston. Sir Henry Clinton, British Commander-in-Chief during the American Revolution, credit, public domain. On June 30, 1779, Clinton expanded on Dunmore's actions and issued the Phillipsburg Proclamation, which promised protection and freedom to all slaves in the colonies who escaped from their patriot masters. Blacks captured fighting for the enemy, however, would be sold into bondage. According to Ma Yejis in often her book A Liberty's Exiles, American loyalists in the Revolutionary World, approximately 20,000 black slaves joined the British during the American Revolution. In contrast, historians estimate that only about 5,000 black men served in the Continental Army. As the American Revolution came to close with the British defeat at Yorktown in 1781, white loyalists and thousands of their slaves evacuated Savannah and Charleston and resettled in Florida and on plantations in the Bahamas. Jamaica and other British territories throughout the Caribbean. The subsequent peace negotiations called for all slaves who escaped behind British lines before November 30, 1782, to be freed with restitution given to their owners. In order to determine which African Americans were eligible for freedom and which weren't, the British verified the names, ages and dates of escape for every runaway slave in their custody and recorded the information in what was called the Book of Negroes. With their certificates of freedom in hand, 3,000 black men, women and children joined the Loyalist exodus from New York to Nova Scotia in 1783. There the black Loyalists found freedom, but little else. After years of economic hardship and denial of the land and provisions they had been promised, nearly half of the black Loyalists abandoned the Canadian province. Approximately 400 sailed to London, while in 1792 more than 1,200 brought their stories full circle and returned to Africa in a new settlement in Sierra Leone. Among the newly relocated was the former slave of the newly elected President of the United States Harry Washington, who returned to the land of his birth. Watch the groundbreaking series Reimagined. Watch Roots now on History.